What if your thoughts aren't entirely you?
Because the most familiar things begin to shift.
Are you sure that you decide first and then act?
But about how, from many voices, the feeling of a single I emerges.
You don't choose what thought appears next.
Jonathan Haidt proposed a model that challenges the way we usually think.
And maybe the distance is a form of freedom. There's a feeling we almost never question. That your thoughts are you. That your decisions are you. That the voice in your head is you. And maybe that's exactly why we almost never ask, what if that's not entirely true? Hi, I'm Kristen. This is a channel about exploring identity. Here we look at things that seems obvious until you start paying closer attention. If this resonates, stay. I'm curious how you see it.
You ever catch yourself wondering, at what point a thought becomes yours? Is it the moment it appears, or only when you notice it? And the strangest part isn't even what the thought is about. It's how little of you seems to be involved between it wasn't there and it's already here, as if something just places it onto an internal screen.
And here's the uncomfortable question. What if your thoughts aren't entirely you? What if they are part of a background process that simply uses you at the place where they appear?
It sounds almost esoteric, almost like something you don't want to believe.
But here's where it gets more interesting. A scientific explanation doesn't remove the mystery, it deepens it. In the early 2000s, neuroscientists discovered something unexpected.
When a person lies in a scanner and isn't focused on any external task, the brain doesn't rest. Quite the opposite. Certain regions remain consistently active, and their activity actually decreases when attention shifts outward. The system was called the default mode network. And already there's a paradox, because the most intuitive assumption is this: thinking is triggered by the outside world. Something happens first, and then a thought appears. But here's what they found. Even without any external input, the system stays active. At first, it seemed like a curious detail, as if the brain just never fully turns off. But later it became clear. This isn't random background noise. It's not meaningless activity. It's internal modeling.
This network becomes especially active when we remember the past, imagine the future, think about ourselves, simulate social situation, or drift into wandering thoughts. This isn't just a stream of random ideas. It's not just mental noise. Researchers link this system to autobiographical memory, the construction of internal sense,
and essentially the ongoing assembly of identity.
So when it feels like you just thinking, there may actually be an entire process unfolding underneath, reconstructing the past, testing possible futures, building scenarios, comparing yourself to others, updating an internal model of who you are.
Which might explain why a thought doesn't feel like a sudden spark, but like something already woven into a story about you. Not just, I had an idea, but more like, Something is already happening inside what I call myself.
And this is where it becomes important. Thoughts don't arise out of nothing. A thought might not be the beginning, it might already be a result. So maybe you're not exactly creating each thought. You notice the outcome of a process that was already happening. And this is why it matters far beyond science.
These mechanisms are already used in advertising, political communication, choice architecture, and attention design. Not to implant thoughts into people, but to increase the probability that a certain thought will feel like their own.
Which is why attention itself has quietly become an art. And no, this doesn't mean your thoughts are not yours. That's an important boundary. This isn't about some external force inside you. Not this isn't you. It's something more subtle and maybe more unsettling. You're not always the one who manually initiates a thought.
Part of your inner life is already unfolding before you notice it. And maybe the most mysterious thing about us isn't anything supernatural. It's that the brain, without any external request, is constantly modeling an inner world, constantly assembling scenes, constantly returning memory, constantly projecting the future, constantly updating who you are.
So the question is no longer just why a thought appeared. The question is deeper. If there is a process constantly modeling me, where exactly am I within it?
If thoughts appear on their own, and part of what's happening inside you starts before you even notice it, then the next question comes up.
Are you sure that you decide first and then act? Or does it only feel that way?
Try to remember a very simple choice. Not something big, just ordinary, like moving your finger or pressing a button.
Do you actually know the exact moment when the decision appears? Or do you just notice that it's already there?
In the 1980s, neuroscientist Benjamin Libet ran a very simple experiment. He asked people to flex their finger at any moment they wanted, and at the same time, he measured brain activity. What he found was unexpected. Activity in the motor cortex started about half a second before the movement, but the moment when the person became aware of the intention came later.
So the brain was already preparing the action before the person knew about it.
In 2008, with fMRI scans, researchers went even further. They could predict which button a person would press, left or right.
Several seconds before the person became aware of the decision. Not perfectly, not every time, but consistently better than chance. And if you step away from the love language and look at this as a normal human experience, it starts to feel a little strange.
As if the decision doesn't begin when you feel it, as if it's already happening quietly, without you. And you don't enter at the beginning of the process, but somewhere in the middle, when it's already unfolding. And then a slightly uncomfortable question appears.
If the brain starts the action earlier and the pattern of the decision forms before awareness, then what exactly are we calling a decision? What is consciousness doing here?
If you break the process into layers like this, it can start to feel a bit unsettling, because the most familiar things begin to shift. Responsibility, choice, control.
If the decisions begins before awareness, then who exactly is making it? It can feel like something has already been decided, and you are just being shown the result. And the line between I did this and this happened in me starts to blur. But here it's important not to jump to another quick conclusion. In psychiatry, there are real conditions where people feel that their thoughts are not theirs. They feel that thoughts come from outside and that someone is putting them there. And this is not philosophy, that is a symptom. And this is exactly where it's easy to go too far too quickly.
Because these experiments don't explain everything. They are about simple actions. Moving a finger, pressing a button, not complex life decisions, not morality, not love. And the predictions are not perfect.
So, science doesn't say free will doesn't exist. It says something more precise. What we call a decision may be earlier than we think, and the process of choosing may be more complex than it feels from the inside.
Maybe consciousness does not start the action. Maybe it becomes aware of it, like something that has already begun. And if you look even closer, consciousness may not be the starting point. It may be the place where the process becomes understandable.
It organizes what's happening, interprets it, and creates a story. And inside that story, the feeling appears. I decide this. But not everyone agrees. Some philosophers suggest looking at it differently. Not asking when does the decision happen, but asking what do we actually call a decision?
Daniel Dennett points out something simple. In these experiments, we measure the moment when a person becomes aware of an intention. But that is not necessarily the moment when the decision begins.
We tend to think awareness means beginning, but it might only be a point of access. Because a decision is not a single moment. It's a process that unfolds over time.
And if this process happens in the brain, then maybe it's not that something else decides for you. Maybe that is you.
Just not in the form you used to.
If the decision begins before you become aware of it, but still happens inside you, where exactly are you in this process? Are you the one who decides, or the one who finds out?
And maybe the question is not whether you have control, but how it actually works. Most people have an inner voice. It feels like thinking is not just a process, but a conversation that keeps going inside.
Try to pause for a second and just notice how you think. Most likely, a thought doesn't stay a feeling. A thought appears and almost immediately takes on a familiar shape. Words, phrases, fragments of sentences.
As if inside there is a voice that explains everything. It comments, clarifies, continues, and almost never raises questions.
What do you say to yourself when you make a mistake? When you doubt something? When something goes right?
Is that really you talking to yourself? Or it's a voice you've just gotten used to?
Almost a century ago, psychologist Lev Vygotsky proposed an idea that is still one of the most accurate models.
Mental functions don't emerge inside a person in isolation. They are formed between people. First, as interaction, then as external speech, and only later as internal.
A child first hears how others speak to them, then begins to speak out loud, and gradually this speech compresses and becomes quieter, faster, more fragmented, until it turns into what we call thinking.
We don't just think, we continue a conversation that once began outside.
Modern research on inner speech, including the work of Charles Fernyhough, shows that inner speech is not a single voice.
It can be dialogic, layered, and shaped by different tones.
Sometimes you're speaking, sometimes it feels like you're responding, as if inside there are already multiple positions.
And then a more precise question appears. If this voice was formed, if it's built from speech you once heard, if it continues to sound inside, why does it feel like a single voice?
In reality, it doesn't have one source. It is memory, experience, social interaction, learned responses.
But it's perceived as one voice, not because it's one, but because the brain assembles it into a single self.
This doesn't mean there are foreign voices inside you. It means something else.
What you call yourself is formed in dialogue, and that dialogue doesn't disappear. It just becomes internal.
And then, it's no longer about whose thoughts these are, not even about who makes decisions, but about how, from many voices, the feeling of a single I emerges.
And maybe the quietest question here is, if this voice could be formed, can it also be changed? If a thought appears before you notice it, if a decision begins before you're aware of it, if the inner voice is not a single voice but a dialogue, then a different question starts to form. What makes an action yours?
Psychologist Daniel Wagner proposed an idea that sounds almost unsettling. The feeling of conscious will is not the cause of an action. It's an explanation the brain creates after the fact. In a series of experiments, participants sat in front of a screen holding a computer mouse, but they weren't alone. Another person was also holding the same mouse and was actually controlling the movement. Objects appeared on the screen, and through headphones, participants would sometimes hear a word. For example, swan. A few seconds later, the cursor would stop on the matching object.
Then they were asked how strongly they felt that they had intended to stop on that image. And something consistent happened.
When the word they heard matched where the cursor stopped, participants were more likely to say that it felt like they had chosen it, even though the movement was controlled by someone else. We experience authorship when three things align.
A thought appears before the action matches their thoughts, and there's no obvious alternative cause, and the brain concludes, I did this. If Wagner shows how this feeling appears, neuroscience tries to understand how it's constructed.
Studies suggest that the sense of I did this is not automatic. It's computed.
The brain predicts the outcome of an action, then compares it to what actually happens. If they match, the feeling of authorship increases. If they don't, it weakens.
In experiments by Patrick Haggard, people were asked to perform a simple action: press a button. After the press, a tone would play with a slight delay. Then participants were asked when they felt the action happened and when the sound occurred. And something strange emerged.
When people press the button themselves, They perceive the sound as happening closer to the action than it actually did. But when their finger was moved externally, that effect disappeared, which suggests something important. The sense of "I did this" is constructed through comparison.
Before the action, the brain already expects what will happen. Then it checks the result.
And it compresses the distance between action and outcome, as if bringing them closer together, as if straightening the link. This was you. Now imagine something simple.
You're sitting, and suddenly a thought appears. I should check my phone. A second later, you pick it up.
The thought came first. The action follows. Nothing interrupts the sequence.
And the feeling appears. I decided to do that.
But there is a detail that almost never gets noticed. You don't choose what thought appears next. If the thought arises on its own and the action unfolds after it, at what point does it become your decision?
If the feeling of authorship depends on matching signals, if it can be strengthened, if it can be created, then who is the author?
Are you the one who initiates, or the one who recognizes the match? And this is where it matters not to jump to a conclusion. An illusion doesn't mean deception. Consciousness may not initiate every action, but it does something else. It means what happens.
Maybe the self is not the source of every impulse. Maybe the self is the system that makes them feel like one.
And then the question is no longer who the creator is, but how the creator is constructed. Have you ever caught yourself having an instant reaction, judgment, rejection, an internal no?
Something happens, and you already know this is wrong, even before you can explain why. And if someone asks you to justify it, you start searching for reasons after the fact.
Imagine a situation. No one is harmed. No one will ever know. There are no consequences.
And still, something inside says, this shouldn't happen.
And here are the questions we rarely ask. Where does that shouldn't come from?
Psychologist Jonathan Haidt proposed a model that challenges the way we usually think.
We tend to assume that first we reason and then we decide.
But in many cases, it works the other way around. First comes the reaction, intuitive, immediate, and only then does the explanation appear. He described it with a metaphor, the emotional dog and its rational tail.
And the problem is, the tail doesn't control the dog.
In experiments, people were given scenarios where no harm was done. No one suffers, no one finds out, no consequences.
And still, the reaction was immediate. This is wrong. When they were asked to explain why, the arguments faded. The feeling stayed.
This state is called moral dumbfounding. The intuition is there, but the explanation isn't.
And that leads to a very uncomfortable question. If the feeling comes first and the explanation comes later, then what exactly are we calling our beliefs?
Did you decide that this is wrong? Or did you notice a reaction that was already there?
And it becomes even more complex because research shows
different cultures feel right differently. What seems obvious in one context may not trigger any reaction in another. Loyalty, authority, purity, freedom.
We don't just think differently, we feel morality differently.
If you had been born in a different time, in a different country, inside a different system of values.
Would the same things still feel right?
This doesn't mean that morality doesn't exist. It doesn't mean that everything is relative or that nothing matters.
Morality is not just logic, it's a system that made it possible for humans to live together,
To trust, to cooperate, to reduce chaos.
It's not random, but it's only fully conscious either.
If thoughts appear before awareness, if decisions begin earlier, if the inner voice is shaped by experience, and even the feeling of right emerges as a reaction.
Then what remains of a pure self? Mindfulness has become a popular word.
Breathe, slow down, accept yourself.
But if we're honest, that's not really what it is. In a scientific sense, mindfulness is not about clearing your mind. It's attention, directed without automatic judgment.
John Kabat-Zinn described it very simply. Not to stop a thought, but to notice it.
He developed a program where people were shown to do something very simple. Pause and observe what's happening inside. Not to change it, not to fix it, not to suppress it.
For example, to follow the breath, and at some point, to notice that attention has already drifted.
Into a memory, into a judgment.
And to bring it back again and again.
Not to think correctly, but to see for the first time how thoughts appear on their own. This was later studied in controlled settings.
In one study, participants practiced this for 8 weeks.
And then researchers look at what changed. Not in how it felt, but in the brain.
Using MRI, they examined structure and activity, and they found changes in areas related to attention and emotional regulation, reduced reactivity in the amygdala, the region involved in rapid emotional responses,
and also reduced activity in networks associated with wandering thoughts and self-critical inner dialogue. The practice doesn't remove thoughts, but it changes how the brain responds to them.
It doesn't make you a different person, but it does one thing. You notice faster what is happening.
Maybe not every thought is the result of deliberate thinking.
But the moment you notice it, is always yours. I'm a failure becomes, I'm having a thought that I'm a failure. Something will go wrong becomes, I'm having a thought that something will go wrong.
And in that moment, the thought stops being your identity and becomes an event. And that is enough for distance to appear.
Not every thought requires belief. Not every reaction requires action. Not every inner voice requires obedience.
Mindfulness doesn't remove automatic process, make you fully free, erase cultural influence, but it does make you less automatic.
If intuition appears before explanation, if a thought comes before choice, if the inner voice is shaped, then the self stops being obvious.
But maybe this is exactly the point where understanding begins.
You don't initiate every process, but you can notice the moment when a thought stops being just a thought. Most of them pass unnoticed, but some of them become direction.
And in that moment, something else appears. Not control, but distance. And maybe that distance is a form of freedom. Not absolute, not complete, but enough not to follow every impulse.